Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
You are listening to Mortification of Spin. So glad that you take the time to listen to us. My name is Todd Pruitt. I'm the pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I'm joined as always by my friend Carl Trueman, who teaches at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. He is a world traveler. People cannot get enough of you, Carl. Every time I look up, I see you somewhere in the world, holding forth, keeping your audiences in rapt attention. It's quite remarkable. How do you do this?
I don't know. I'm just channeling my inner Elvis, I guess.
I guess so. Now, you were just down in, of course, we're recording this. It's right around the middle of January.
Yeah.
But you were just down in Florida with our friend Matt Busey.
I was.
West Palm Beach.
Yeah.
A little bit different than Western Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah, although with the exception of a couple of hours on the Saturday morning, it poured with rain the entire time we were there. Nice. I mean, it was warm enough. It was between 60 and 80 degrees at any given point, but no, it was lashing down with rain. So my wife and I did sit outside on Matt's sort of Florida room.
Right.
Got some fresh air, but it was not quite the Florida trip we had hoped
for. Now, did he drive you over the bridge to the island, to Palm Beach Island? Did you drive by Mar-a-Lago?
We didn't go by Mar-a-Lago.
Okay.
My big request was to be driven by the canals to see some alligators.
Oh, well.
I've seen alligators in the wild before at Kiowa Island, but I wanted Katrina, my wife, to see an alligator in the wild. And we did spot one, just breaking the surface in the canals. It's it's
our
the
present day
Leviathan.
Dinosaurs. Yeah, it's our present day dinosaurs.
They are an amazing creature.
Indeed. They haunt the nightmares of children.
Yeah. But Matt's doing well, very well.
Yes. Indeed. Yeah. Well, good. Well, listen, Carl, you and I were talking not long ago. This year is the 80th anniversary of the Abolition of Man. C.S. Lewis's lectures that became a book, lectures that he was not fully persuaded were effective, a book that I think he probably suspected would be given very little attention, and probably a lot of contemporaries of his might have thought it wouldn't have gotten much attention, just given the esoteric nature of the philosophical categories and language he uses. But here it is, 80 years later, and it's, to my knowledge, never gone out of print. You can get all kinds of different editions of it out there, as well as published commentaries on it. People are talking more about the Abolition of Man, those lectures, that book, over the last 20 years probably, than they were ever when he first gave and published those lectures. That's probably true, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I think what Lewis was doing, and probably was not fully aware that he was doing, was putting his finger on what would manifest itself as the underlying problem of the modern world, which is the complete collapse in the notion of human nature, what it means to be a man, what it means to be human. I think Lewis, like a lot of great books, I think on the negative side, I think of some of the stuff that Nietzsche wrote in the 19th century, or on a more Christian note, you could think of some of the novels that Dostoevsky wrote in the 19th century. They're books that put their finger on something that's already going on, but has not yet percolated through the whole of society. I think that's what Lewis does in The Abolition of Man. He's writing at the height of the Second World War. He's a veteran, of course, of the First World War himself. He knows about man's inhumanity to man. And he puts forth these three very brief lectures, which in a very succinct form put their finger on the fact that what it means to be a human being in terms of, we might say, an agreed moral structure,
right,
is crumbling and collapsing. And he sees that that's going to be a real problem. And it's taken us, 80 years to see the full fruits of that
right.
emerge within our culture.
Now, I think a lot of people become fans of Lewis. They've read Narnia, they've read Mere Christianity, and so they see, oh, here's another one, Abolition of Man, and they pick it up and they say, what in the world is this? I was expecting Mere Christianity Part 2. And we have to understand, and I would like more people to wrestle through Abolition of Man, particularly now, for reasons you just mentioned and what we'll talk about a little bit more. But again, these were lectures originally delivered under the heading of kind of religion and public life, and yet this is some of the least, quote, theological or even religious works of Lewis's post-conversion career. It's very philosophical, and yet we would say that Lewis is still looking at this through a generally biblical lens, because that's who he was at this point. He's a Christian man wrestling with some of these things. And in terms of structure, you mentioned these 3 lectures. The other thing I think bears repeating, and this is maybe one of the reasons why we appreciate it, is that he's the kind of winsome, hopeful Lewis that we see in so much of his writing is not present in the Abolition of Man, is it?
No, it's very much, again, to set it in context, this is a man thinking and writing in the context of the Second World War. It's a very dark period in history. You can find, it's interesting, I was reading an essay by the Polish poet, Czesław Miłosz, written at around the same time, touching on very similar themes. It's very clear that the darkness that is engulfing the world, or at least Europe at that particular point in time, is something that's on the mind of a lot of intellectuals. So, no, it's not a particularly hopeful thing. But then again, it's also not intended to be that. It's more of a piece of cultural analysis or criticism. And again, I think you're right to say it doesn't seem to be as explicitly Christian as certainly as Mere Christianity or Screwtape Letters. But what he's doing there, I think, is attempting to engage his audience with something that anybody with eyes to see should see unfolding around them. And he's highlighting, if you like, but I think, the underlying theme of the work is he's highlighting the problems that moral relativism create for what it means to be a human being. And if that was true in 1943, 44, how true is that today in 2024?
Right. Yeah. There are some things there are statements, particularly I would say in the third lecture, but there are statements that are chilling in their relevance today in what we're asking about. Does being a human have any objective meaning? And he's really wanting to get at the fact that there is something objective about value. There's got to be something objective about value, or else all is lost. Yeah. And I wonder, I mean, he fought in the First World War, which was I don't think many contemporary Americans can get their mind around just how savage the First World War was. He saw that. He was nearly blown up himself. And then the Second World War. And of course, he was cognizant of what was going on with Nazi Germany and the attempts to rationalize evil, rationalize wickedness, excuse it, separate the heart from the mind, get the heart out of this, or get emotion, or get any idea of trying to synthesize rationality with love, or those kinds of things. And he coins this really interesting. Well, first of all, just kind of explain. He's working with metaphors here, and some pretty intricate ones. And he pictures the body and he kind of subdivides it into three sections: the head, the chest, and the stomach. Where's he going with that?
Well, I think, again, he's touching on this idea of subjectivism, and he's really saying that, we often talk about the conflict between the head and the heart, for example. And what he's talking about there is, let's say that ideas, as we think, as we have ideas, they don't exist in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing, for example, for say a professional philosopher to be able to lecture on right and wrong and to be able to talk about morality. Mm-hmm. But for him to truly think in a moral way, there has to be more to it than that. He has this phrase, men without chests. Right. Which is slightly confusing because I think, these days with all the debates about masculinity, et cetera, the intuitive response to men without chest is he's talking about
bravado,
pigeon-chested wimps or something like this. What he's actually talking about there is, we might say, men without virtues. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to have. It's one thing to have read Kant's Metaphysics of the Groundwork of Morals, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, and to understand what moral theology is. It's another thing. Philosophy is. It's another thing to actually have, we would say, moral intuitions. Mm-hmm. It's another thing to understand human nature as having a moral compass and a moral structure that requires us to behave in certain ways and not in others. I mean, the underlying theme of the book, Knowledge Ways, as you pointed to, these value judgments have to have some kind of objective grounding. He's anticipating in many ways what Alistair McIntyre will do in 1980 in his book After Virtue, where McIntyre says, the problem with a lot of modern moral discourse is it sounds as if it's referring to good and evil, right? But what it's actually doing is just giving expression to personal taste. Yeah. So, to say murder is wrong is akin to saying, I find that sculpture to be ugly. There's no real difference. You're expressing an aesthetic personal response. You're not connecting to something that's real. And the men without chests idea is his way of getting at that idea. It's men who really have no moral virtue. They have no consciousness of their own moral structure. Right. That so actually allows them to behave in a moral way.
Right. So they've got cognition, the head. They've got desire. Appetites, the will, the stomach. But what's missing as he looked around was then what he identifies in the chest, which is that moral filter that connects the two so that the man acts and behaves and thinks morally.
And what we would traditionally call virtues. Right. We try to train our children as they're growing up. We don't teach them case law in terms of, if you're in this situation, this is how you act. If you're in that situation, we try to cultivate general virtues so that when they're confronted with particular and often very unique situations, they intuitively know how to respond in a moral way because they have chests. Right. They have this moral compass. They have this formed virtue, we might say. And I think that's, again, and it connects to Lewis's idea. He's the idea of the Tao, which is, it's an Eastern idea, and that can make Christians a little nervous when they read it. But what he's referring to with the Tao is what Christian theology would traditionally call natural law. Right. He's really trying to get to the idea that the universe has a moral shape. Yeah. It's not just a heap of stuff. It has a moral shape. And would that he'd actually, why he doesn't use Western Christian vocabulary to describe that, who knows?
But one thing that occurred to me is that, so here he is, he appeals to the Tao, Eastern categories. He appeals to the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, etc. Yeah. And I wonder if possibly what's behind that, at least in part, is an effort on his part to show that what he's talking about here is knowledge that is written on the heart, so to speak. It's, as you said, natural law. It is something that every culture, even if they get it wrong in some of the application, they know that there's something there that has to be dealt with.
Yeah, the moral structure of human nature is
Yeah.
not a social construct.
Right.
Now, there are some socially constructed aspects of human
Right.
nature. British people, American people, Koreans behave in different ways in different circumstances. What he's trying to get at is that actually, no, murdering infants is wrong wherever you
Right.
are. That's just not something that a human can do without degrading their human nature, without fundamentally dehumanizing themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, it's the kind of book that I could imagine a guy like Steven Pinker, for example, who's an atheist.
Right.
But I can imagine Steven Pinker reading Lewis's Abolition of Man and saying, there's a lot here I can get on board with.
Right.
Because, I do believe
Mm-hmm.
there is such a thing as human nature. I do believe there is such a thing as morality. We can have moral discussions.
Right. And that's an interesting challenge for the atheist, because suddenly that thrusts them into whether they acknowledge it or not. It begins to thrust them into the realm of kind of metaphysical categories, that there might be something a little bit bigger than us. And Lewis, in his whole idea of the men without chests, basically what he's saying, if that's not working, if that's not happening, then we become less than human.
Yeah.
That we're no longer like what makes us uniquely human is this moral reasoning, and when we fail to do, when we stop doing that, then we become something other than human. In a practical way. And
Milosz, in the essay I referred to, Milosz puts it very strongly. Now, he's Polish. He's writing at ground zero for the Holocaust.
Right.
And he makes the comment to the effect of, if we lose sight of common human nature, and he's actually made in the image of God, but if we lose sight of common human nature as having a moral structure, he said, it's just a short step, he says, to young men in clean uniforms, executing other people while munching on a ham sandwich. It's a very sort of powerful image of, ordinariness and horror. And that's
something he had seen. I mean, he knew that that's what happens.
This is the Holocaust. This is the Einsatzgruppen, operating in occupied Poland.
Right.
So he's making a connection there that Lewis, I think, is making less dramatically, but the underlying point that the loss of moral structure of human nature has catastrophic consequences is clear. And then when you move forward to, we're almost a quarter of the way into the 21st century. What do we have? Well, we have, 1 in 20 Canadians now dying as a result of assisted suicide.
Right.
We have, the backlash against the fall of Roe v. Wade has been spoken very eloquently about how people, right and left, don't have much of a problem with abortion.
Right.
We have catastrophic levels of casual violence in inner city. We have, we have the way people talk to each other online in very dehumanized kind of ways.
Right.
We have sexual perversions being paraded. Forget LGB stuff. We're way out there with BDSM.
Yeah, that's old fashioned now. Just LGP is
what Lewis is pointing to in a sort of philosophical way, we now see the consequences. And when you watch these programs on TV where, the comedian goes up to somebody in the street and says, is it wrong to do X? And the person is struggling to give an answer. And it kind of comes in, well, I don't like that, but hey, if it works for you, that's exactly the kind of world that Lewis is predicting in the Abolition of Man.
It was interesting, Lewis writing this during the Second World War. In one of the books I've read in the last 5 years or so on the rise of Nazism, one of the things that struck me is how often, and this was particularly true in the 30s, it started to shift further into the war, but with the rise of Nazism, one of the things that you saw all the time, even with like Himmler, is that they were almost at pains to talk about how their what they were recommending for the Jews and saying about the Jews did not come out of malice. It was just science. Listen, we don't hate them. We know that there's plenty of Jewish people that you may like, that might have done you a good turn. This isn't about hate or anything like that. This is just we're just doing science here. In other words, and again, the chest is gone at that point. All I'm doing is just processing information.
Yeah. It's that, and that's why the prequel to the elimination of the Jews was, of course, the euthanasia program of the 1930s, where kiddies with encephalitis would be euthanized, because that's the merciful thing to
That's
do.
right. It's just science.
And I mean, even you move to the present day, we get similar arguments
for transgenderism. Well, this is just this is just the science. Do you not believe the science on this or whatever?
Yeah. And even the language use, Iceland has eliminated Down syndrome.
Right. No, they haven't.
Think about that. No, it hasn't. It's eliminated people with Down syndrome.
Exactly.
Somebody's decided that people with Down syndrome actually make the world worse.
Right.
And everybody's bought into that. And
this
is exactly the kind of stuff that C.S. Lewis was predicting.
It's an inhumane. We have a word for this, inhumane, meaning this is not consistent with a human, because a human has been gifted with moral reasoning. Yeah. And so if you destroy children with Down syndrome, that's there was a generation that would have called that inhumane, inconsistent with being human.
Yeah.
Well,
there's the wonderful article by my good friend Fran Mayer at First Things on describing how he felt when he discovered that his youngest son Dan had Downs. And he talks beautifully there about how much joy and richness Dan has brought into the world, how his other children will never not see disabled people, will never fail to understand the predicaments of those struggling with disabilities. And you read that article and you think, Fran realizes that Dan is a human being,
right,
and therefore his existence enriches the life of all those with whom he comes into contact. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that Lewis is worried about losing when he writes The Abolition. Remarkably prophetic text.
Incredibly, yeah. So we would encourage you again. I know a lot of folks, because you love to read C.S. Lewis, and for good reason. He was a wonderful writer. And then you end up picking Abolition of Man and wondering what in the world you're reading. It's esoteric, it's philosophical, but hopefully our discussion here has helped a little bit for you to, if you put it down, go back to it and think about it in kind of some of the categories we've talked about. I hope that's what our folks will do.
And it's very, very brief as well.
It is.
I mean, you're talking about 90 pages.
Right. Like it's 3 lectures, and those were fairly brief lectures. Yeah.
Read it through and then read it again. And I've forgotten the name of the author, but there is a wonderful commentary written actually by a Catholic priest, I think, in Oxford. It's entitled, I think, After Humanity.
Yes, I have that. That's sitting on my desk right now.
It's a wonderful book, and it's probably 4 times the length of the original.
It is.
He is to C.S. Lewis what Greg Beale is to the Book of Revelation, but not quite to the same extent.
Yes,
but there are some many good books out there that will enable you to get access to Lewis's arguments. So we hope the discussion of C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man has helped you. As always, Lewis writes so beautifully. You cannot fail to have your own English improved, I think, when you read C.S. Lewis. So recommend that book to you. If you go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, you can enter a chance to win not the Abolition of Man, because we were unable to chisel any freebies out of the publisher, but a chance to win the Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, How Great Books Shaped a Great Mind.
And that's a good book.
Jason Baxter. It's a good book. And a reminder to us all that, reading great books is a way of improving our minds. So recommend you go to our website. While you're there, if you feel led, please make a donation to Mortification of Spin. We are a listener-supported podcast. We'd also recommend that you go to the Alliance website and look there for the PCRT that's occurring in March this year in Lansing and in
Bryn Mawr.
Proclamation in Bryn Mawr. My mind went blank. Speakers Peter Jones, Aaron Wren, and the Alliance's very own Richard Phillips. speaking about the Christian in a modern and hostile world. Some of the very things that Lewis was anticipating will, I'm sure, be addressed at that conference. So in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to being with you in 2 weeks' time.
Children of Israel were to multiply.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.